Judge tries to silence black woman in court, freezes to learn she's a top CIA intelligence officer. A hushed silence stretched across the packed courtroom as Judge Conrad Wilkins leveled a stern gaze upon the tall, poised black woman at the defense table. On the surface, it seemed like a straightforward hearing, another day of motions and testimonies inside the austere walls of the Washington, D.C. Superior Court. But something in the air crackled with tension. Her unwavering eyes and unflinching posture set her apart, as if she possessed knowledge that could upend everything Judge Wilkins thought he knew. Little did anyone realize when he tried to silence her voice, he'd be challenging far more than a mere civilian. He'd be crossing a top CIA intelligence officer. The courtroom was bright and bustling. It was a busy day. The docket was packed with civil disputes, traffic violations, and pretrial motions. Yet, on this particular morning, courtroom 4B drew more onlookers than usual. Word traveled quickly that something extraordinary might happen. The presiding judge, Conrad Wilkins, was known for his stern approach, partly because he prided himself on courtroom efficiency, and partly because he harbored a certain impatience that had developed into borderline arrogance over the years. Outside the courtroom, reporters milled about, pressing their ears against the heavy wooden doors for any sign of a commotion. They knew that inside those walls, a fire was about to ignite. Esther Howard stepped into the corridor wearing a charcoal grey pantsuit and a quiet confidence that belied the swirl of tension in the air. She was a tall, graceful black woman in her early 40s, her hair styled in a neat bun. Today she was here for a hearing related to a small, real estate dispute, at least. That was what the official record said. In truth, her presence would soon carry far more weight than anyone, especially Judge Wilkins, was prepared to handle. People turned to look at her. There was nothing ostentatious about her appearance, no flashy jewelry or flamboyant clothing. Yet she had the aura of someone who commanded respect. She carried a slim leather briefcase that she clutched a bit too tightly, betraying some hidden nerves. But when she opened the door to courtroom 4B, her shoulders squared and she lifted her chin ever so slightly. Inside, hush fell over the rows of onlookers who had been chattering among themselves. The judge's bench stood at the far end of the room, a place of authority that Judge Wilkins occupied like a throne. Esther caught sight of him immediately. Wilkins sat perched behind the heavy wooden desk, with a regal posture, flipping through papers and occasionally peering over his thin reading glasses. A pang of intuition shot through Esther's gut. She had dealt with formidable men before, men in war zones, men in private intelligence bunkers, men with secrets as lethal as loaded guns. She could sense something in the judge's tight-lipped expression. There was a coldness there, a certain readiness to exert power. As she took a seat next to her attorney, a ripple of curiosity buzzed through the spectators. They couldn't know that, beneath her composed exterior, lay a reservoir of experiences that spanned continents, involved covert operations, and shaped global events. Judge Wilkins would soon learn that Esther Howard was no ordinary citizen, and that trying to silence her would unleash consequences more far-reaching than he could ever imagine. Judge Conrad Wilkins was a man who had always craved influence. Born in Boston to a lineage of Ivy League alumni, he grew up entrenched in an environment that prized achievement, particularly if it translated to power. His father had been a district attorney and his grandfather a federal judge. Wilkins followed in their footsteps with meticulous precision: Harvard Law School, then a clerkship under a revered Supreme Court justice, and finally an appointment as a federal prosecutor before he donned the black robe. He had ascended quickly through the ranks, earning a reputation for uncompromising rulings. Colleagues described him as brilliant but severe, praising his legal acumen while quietly acknowledging his sometimes dictatorial approach from the bench. Defendants who encountered Wilkins knew that if their arguments weren't airtight, he'd slice them apart with a scalpel-like intellect and then drive the final nail with his powerful gavel. Defense attorneys learned to prepare meticulously. The faintest miscalculation could sink their case. After more than a decade on the bench, Wilkins had been transferred to Washington, D.C. Superior Court. It was a station below the federal courts he had once graced, and if rumor held any truth, it was a demotion disguised as a lateral move. Whispers said that Wilkins had clashed with his superiors, likely those in the political arena, who believed the judge's harsh sentences and unyielding manner risked overshadowing justice itself. Though he rarely expressed frustration publicly, Wilkins viewed his new position as a slight. He believed that his talents were undervalued and that the system, which should have lauded him, had instead relegated him to lesser matters. Every day, he scanned the docket with a grim face, irritated by petty cases, longing for the complex, high-profile trials that once defined his career. Behind his formidable persona lay an undeniable bias. He believed he was an even-handed arbiter of the law, but in truth, certain prejudices shaped his rulings. He was particularly skeptical of defendants he viewed as unscrupulous outsiders, and was quick to muzzle attorneys or litigants who spoke out of turn. He disliked challenges to his authority, especially from those he deemed beneath him in status or intellect. It was precisely this mindset that steered Judge Wilkins into dangerous waters on the day Esther Howard appeared before him. From the moment he read the name Esther Howard on the docket, something about it rubbed him the wrong way. He saw she was representing herself alongside a seemingly fresh-faced legal advisor. He assumed she was just another defiant individual who refused to follow the conventional script, someone who'd slow down his proceedings and test his patience. That morning, Wilkins arrived in his chambers, determined to handle every case on the docket swiftly. He despised procrastination, believed his time was more valuable than that of anyone else in the courtroom, and refused to indulge extended arguments. He had garnered a reputation for cutting off anyone, be they plaintiffs, defendants, or counsel, if he felt their statements were irrelevant or long-winded. In his worldview, respect in the courtroom was a one-way street. You gave it to him, and if you were lucky, he might return a shred of it back to you. With a flurry of robes, he entered courtroom 4B that day with the intention to maintain total control. What Judge Wilkins could not anticipate, what all his training, experience, and connections in high places could not prepare him for, was that the unassuming woman he intended to silence carried secrets more potent than any he had ever confronted. Underestimating her would be his greatest mistake and the catalyst for a chain of events that would soon spiral beyond his jurisdiction. Seated beside her pro bono attorney, a mild-mannered yet determined young man named Marcus Jeffries Esther, Howard opened her worn leather briefcase. Inside were neatly arranged folders, each filled with documents relevant to the case. The dispute itself was trivial on its surface, a contested ownership claim on a small property in the outskirts of D.C. The building in question wasn't lavish, but it stood in a strategic location near a newly planned government facility. There was speculation among local residents about who really owned it and why it was so fiercely coveted. Esther had no interest in letting outsiders discover her deeper reasons for buying that property. She'd carefully chosen it as a safe house, a space that could be used if covert operations ever spilled over into domestic territory. She'd acquired it under a subsidiary name, part of a standard CIA procedure to secure unassuming assets across the country. Yet, the local real estate agent had made an error, recording the deed incorrectly. That error led to the present fiasco, a lawsuit disputing the legitimacy of her ownership. Normally, the agency's legal team would step in to sort out the mess quietly. However, Esther, who valued her autonomy in certain matters, insisted on personally overseeing the case. From the judge's bench, Wilkins cleared his throat. "Miss Howard," he began, his tone clipped, "are you and your attorney prepared for today's hearing?" Esther rose to address him. "Yes, Your Honor." "We state your name for the record," Wilkins interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of impatience. "Esther Howard, Your Honor," she responded calmly, his eyes flicked over her. "Miss Howard, I want to remind you that this court values efficiency. We're not here to waste time. We have many cases on the docket." "I understand," Esther said, her voice measured. She gestured to Marcus. "We have all the necessary documents to prove." Wilkins raised a hand sharply. "Speak only when I address you." "Understood." A faint murmur fluttered through the courtroom. Marcus looked uneasy, but Esther maintained her composure. Inside, a surge of frustration threatened to burn through her calm, but she'd been in far more volatile situations. This was small potatoes compared to high-stakes interrogations in foreign territories. She nodded, willing to follow protocol for now. Wilkins then turned to the plaintiff's side, a stout, older man named Harvey Rourke, who claimed that the property was his inheritance from a distant relative. Without glancing at Esther's documents, Wilkins asked, "Mr. Rourke, do you have a statement?" As Rourke launched into his complaint, Esther noticed how the judge leaned forward, giving Rourke his full attention. She recognized the tactic, a subtle favoritism, a display that he was listening carefully to one side while marginalizing the other. It sent a clear message that if Esther dared to interject, she'd be stepping on dangerous ground. Under normal circumstances, she might have brushed it aside. But Esther felt a storm brewing, a sense that today would test not only her patience, but also how far she would go to protect who she truly was. The courtroom's fluorescent lights seemed to glare down on the tension that simmered just below the surface. As Mr. Rourke recited his claims, largely hearsay and incomplete genealogical records, Esther skimmed through her own file. She had documented evidence, not just official deeds, but also financial transactions dating back 3 years. Everything proved she'd lawfully purchased the property from a subsidiary once quietly associated with the agency. She'd come prepared to settle this swiftly. However, the moment she attempted to share her evidence, Judge Wilkins cut her off. "Miss Howard, is your counsel prepared to speak?" he asked pointedly, looking past her to Marcus. The judge's tone suggested that he believed the proper channel for her input was strictly through her attorney. Marcus rose, adjusting his tie. "Yes, Your Honor. We have these documents." Wilkins held up a palm. "Save it for a formal presentation. I want to hear more from the plaintiff first." A collective, uncomfortable silence blanketed the courtroom. Marcus shot Esther a sidelong glance, silently asking if she was okay. She offered the faintest nod. This was no time to create an outburst, but she took a deep breath, reminding herself to remain steady. After another 10 minutes of Mr. Rourke's rambling anecdotal claims, Esther's patience wore thin. She stood up, politely clearing her throat. "Your Honor, if I may, Miss Howard." Wilkins narrowed his eyes. "Have you forgotten my instruction about speaking out of turn? I apologize, Your Honor. However, what Mr. Rourke is claiming directly contradicts the documented evidence we've submitted, and I believe it's critical." The judge's gavel hammered against the block, startling several spectators. "Sit down," he barked. Esther paused. The official record would mark the judge's rebuke, but behind that single harsh command lay an undercurrent of condescension. A less experienced individual might have melted under that glare, but Esther had faced warlords and terrorists. This was a man in a robe, brandishing a gavel, not a rifle. And yet, there was something about the blatant show of disrespect that caused a flicker of indignation behind her measured eyes. She lowered herself back into her seat, but she did not look away from Judge Wilkins. He returned her stare, perhaps expecting to see fear. Instead, he found resolve. The tension between them was palpable. A single misstep, a single word out of line, and Wilkins would make an example of her. Marcus tried to salvage the moment. Clearing his throat, he stood again. "Your Honor, I believe Miss Howard, and I can clarify these points. If you'd allow us a few minutes." Wilkins gave a brisk nod, letting out a small, exasperated sigh. "Proceed." Marcus carefully presented the official sale documents, but after barely a moment's glance, Wilkins frowned. "These records are consistent with your client's claim, but they are overshadowed by the fact that Mr. Rourke's genealogical evidence indicates a familial tie to the original property owner." "Your Honor," Marcus said, "if we examine the actual deed, it shows Miss Howard purchased it from the legitimate previous owner, and the transaction was approved by—" Wilkins cut him off again. "Let's not get bogged down in all these technicalities. The question here is whether Miss Howard's name on the deed is valid in light of potential inheritance claims." Esther's knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the table. "Technicalities?" she repeated under her breath, incredulous that the judge was downplaying what was literally the legal foundation of a property dispute. Wilkins noticed Esther's reaction. He aimed his gaze directly at her. "Miss Howard, if you interrupt once more, I will hold you in contempt of court." An uneasy wave of murmurs rolled through the gallery. Esther inhaled, summoning the discipline that had been drilled into her through years of training. She had to tread carefully. She was not ready nor willing to reveal her CIA status. That would blow open questions and scrutiny she didn't need. She'd come hoping for a quiet resolution, but now it felt like the entire system wanted to muzzle her. Judge Wilkins banged his gavel again. "I'll set a short recess, then we'll continue." With that, he stood abruptly and disappeared into his chambers, robes billowing behind him. The bailiff announced the recess, and the tension in the courtroom dissipated into a flurry of whispered conversations. Esther turned to Marcus. "I'm concerned about this, Judge. He's clearly biased." Marcus sighed. "He has a reputation, yes, but I didn't anticipate he'd be so brazen about it today." Esther glanced around. Reporters hovered, scribbling in notepads, their eyes darting at her. She sensed the swirling interest, the building thirst for a story. A part of her wanted to walk away, let agency lawyers handle it from behind the scenes. But she was determined to see this through. Her quiet mission required that she hold on to the property. As they waited, Esther noticed the side door leading to Wilkins' chambers. She also noticed an uneasy flurry of movement near it, a clerk flitting in and out, as though carrying urgent messages. She had no idea that the judge was already consulting with certain individuals behind the scenes, that he was gambling on exerting his judicial power over a woman he assumed was powerless to resist. What Wilkins didn't realize was that he was prodding a lioness, and soon enough he'd feel the force of her roar. While the court recessed, Esther found a quiet bench outside the courtroom. At first glance, people might have thought she was just another litigant burying her head in paperwork. But her mind drifted far from the dusty legal documents to the winding path that had brought her here. She was born in Charleston, South Carolina, in a modest neighborhood where resilience and communal support were as vital as sunshine and water. Esther's parents were devout people of deep integrity. Her father worked as a history teacher at a local high school, instilling in her a profound respect for knowledge. Her mother, a nurse, taught her compassion for people's struggles and the strength to face them head-on. From a young age, Esther displayed an insatiable curiosity. She devoured books the way other kids devoured candy bars. In school, she was bright but quietly, so she wasn't the type to hog the limelight. She sat in the second row, listened intently, and raised her hand only when she was sure of her answer. Teachers recognized her gift, a sharp intellect balanced by humility. The first significant turning point came when she was 14. During a family road trip, they visited the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. Inside the National Air and Space Museum, she stood transfixed before exhibits that showcased humankind's drive to explore and discover. Something about being in the nation's capital, surrounded by monuments to both the best and worst of humanity, sparked a new fire in her. Even then, Esther felt the weight of her heritage as an African American, aware of the past struggles and ongoing fight for equality. She made a quiet vow she would do something meaningful, something that helped protect the ideals of a country still grappling with its contradictions. By the time she graduated high school, she was valedictorian. Her speech was not ostentatious, but spoke of hope, unity, and the subtle power of knowledge. She caught the attention of local influencers, one of whom recommended her for a scholarship to Georgetown University. She applied, was accepted, and by 19, she was studying international relations in the heart of the nation's political epicenter. It was at Georgetown that she encountered her second major turning point. A professor named Dr. Malcolm Atkins, who had connections to the intelligence community, noticed her keen, analytical mind. During an after-class discussion on global espionage, he asked if she'd ever considered a career in intelligence. At the time, she hadn't, but the seed was planted. Shortly thereafter, she joined a special program that allowed select undergraduates to intern with government agencies. Esther found herself at the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, over summer breaks. There, she was introduced to the structured chaos of intelligence work, unending streams of data, the thrill of piecing together scattered clues, and the sobering responsibility that came with each revelation. Esther excelled, surprising even veteran analysts with her ability to pass through murky information to uncover hidden patterns. Upon completing her degree, the CIA offered her a position as an intelligence analyst. She accepted, diving headfirst into a world that existed beneath the public eye, a shadow realm where alliances shifted as quickly as desert sands, and the truth was often tangled in multiple layers of secrecy. Her first few years were spent in the intelligence offices, mastering tradecraft. Eventually, though, the agency recognized her aptitude extended beyond desk work. She was adept at reading people, adjusting her demeanor to fit tense or delicate situations, and extracting crucial data through skillful conversation. She took specialized training courses, psychological profiling, cryptography, covert communications. She learned to defend herself physically, practicing Krav Maga until her body memorized reflexes that could incapacitate an attacker twice her size. Her ascension to a field operations role was unusual for someone who started as an analyst. But the agency had a habit of placing valuable assets wherever they'd do the most good. Over the next decade, she traveled extensively across the globe, Europe, the Middle East, parts of Africa, often working undercover. She dismantled terrorist cells, brokered clandestine deals that prevented rogue organizations from obtaining dangerous technology, and rescued innocent people trapped in the crossfire of global espionage. One operation in particular solidified her legend within the CIA. It was in Northern Africa, where a terror group had kidnapped an American diplomat. While negotiations stalled, Esther infiltrated the group circle by posing as an international journalist sympathetic to their cause. With careful maneuvering, she gained the kidnappers' trust just enough to gather intel on the diplomat's location. Then, coordinating with local forces, she orchestrated a daring midnight rescue. The diplomat returned home safely, and the perpetrators were arrested, their entire operation collapsing soon after. Word of her successes reached the highest ranks of the agency. She even met with William J. Burns, the real-life CIA director, on one occasion, who, Upon reading her commendations, told her solemnly, "Your work has saved lives, Miss Howard. Our country owes you a debt." Yet with each triumph, Esther felt the burden of secrecy grow heavier. She had to live two lives, one as a dedicated intelligence officer for her nation, and another as just Esther, a woman whose friends and family often wondered why she vanished for weeks at a time. Despite the challenges, she pressed on, believing in the mission's importance. But after years in the field, she requested a change in her operational status. She wanted to return to the States, put down some roots, and maybe find a semblance of personal normalcy. The CIA agreed, though they kept her on active status in case her expertise was needed. In her new role, Esther began investing her time and resources in a few properties across the country. The agency quietly encouraged it, seeing potential safe houses or quick drop sites in her acquisitions. Everything was discreet shell companies, quiet paperwork, no big red flags. The property in D.C. that she was now fighting for in court was one such asset. She never imagined that a simple mistake in a real estate transaction could escalate into a legal battle in open court. Nor had she predicted that a domineering judge named Conrad Wilkins would go to such lengths to silence her. But as she sat on the bench, her mind traveling across the tapestry of her past, she understood something fundamental. She had faced threats far deadlier than a hostile judge. And she wasn't about to let this man walk all over her rights, nor compromise her mission for a place she considered crucial to national security contingencies. When the bailiff announced that court was back in session, Esther rose, gathered her documents, and steeled herself. Judge Wilkins might think he held all the power inside those four walls, but he had no idea who he was dealing with or how spectacularly his day was about to unravel. The bailiff's voice echoed through the corridor, "All rise." Everyone in the gallery stood as Judge Wilkins returned to the bench. His expression was as rigid as before, lips pressed into a thin line, eyes scanning the room. It was as if he relished the hush that enveloped the courtroom, a tangible manifestation of his authority. He settled into his seat and tapped his gavel lightly. "We will resume the case of Rourke versus Howard. Mr. Rourke, do you have anything further to add to your statement?" The plaintiff stood and offered a few more details regarding his family's supposed claim, but his argument lacked any tangible evidence. It was mostly an emotional plea, referencing heritage and sentimental value. Wilkins nodded sympathetically, as if Rourke's unsubstantiated words carried weight. Finally, the judge turned a steely gaze to Esther and Marcus. "Miss Howard and counsel, I'm prepared to make a ruling unless you have something significant to present." Marcus hurriedly rose. "Your Honor, the defense has already submitted over 70 pages of documentation, which include property records, transaction histories, and even communication logs with the previous owners. We respectfully request that the court review these materials thoroughly. We believe they conclusively establish Miss Howard's rightful ownership." Esther watched Wilkins carefully. His body language read like a man who'd already made up his mind. She could almost see the wheels turning in his head, some mixture of annoyance and a desire to assert dominance. "Mr. Jeffries," Wilkins said, addressing Marcus, "the court doesn't have time to read every single page of your client's submissions. I expect concise briefs summarizing the essential points." "We filed a summary brief as well, Your Honor," Marcus replied evenly, refusing to back down. Esther decided to speak up, hoping a calm, rational approach might reach the judge. "Your Honor, may I clarify something about the nature of these documents?" Wilkins exhaled, clearly displeased. Briefly, she met his stare. "These documents aren't just random acquisitions. They trace the chain of title over the past 2 decades, showing exactly how the property changed hands. The last rightful owner sold it to me, and we have the notarized deed which," I said briefly. Wilkins' voice cut through the air. "You're repeating what your attorney already stated." If this is all you have, then we're done. Esther felt her pulse spike. The man was blatantly railroading the process. She saw no glimmer of fairness in his demeanor. Why would a judge be so dismissive of hard evidence in a straightforward property case? She forced her tone to remain measured. Your Honor, we request an evidentiary hearing so an independent review can be made. It's standard practice in a disputed title situation. The judge scowled. I find no need for additional hearings. You haven't presented anything that counters Mr. Rourke's genealogical claim. Marcus's mouth dropped open in protest. But, Your Honor, Wilkins raised the gavel, and for a moment it appeared he was ready to hammer down a ruling in favor of the plaintiff. Right then and there, a murmur of astonishment rippled through the gallery. Reporters began scribbling furiously, sensing a headline, "Judge sides with genealogical claim over documented deed." Esther's heart thudded in her chest. She told herself to remain calm, to consider her next move carefully. She had spent her life training to handle crises, to find an opening when the walls were closing in. Swiftly, she decided to escalate, though she had never intended to reveal her CIA status. It was beginning to feel like the only leverage that could pierce through the judge's stone faced disregard for facts. Yet, she hesitated. Revealing that information publicly could jeopardize other operations. She needed a strategic approach. If she was going to do it, she'd do it in a controlled way. Taking a slow breath, she stood. Your Honor, before you make a final ruling, I request a moment to speak to you in private chambers. It pertains to a matter of national security. The courtroom erupted into hushed chatter, with reporters snapping to attention. Wilkins looked at her in open disbelief. National security? Don't be ridiculous. This is a real estate dispute, Miss Howard. Esther locked eyes with him. I assure you, Your Honor, it's not ridiculous. If you would allow just a few minutes off the record, I can explain. The judge glowered, his jaw set. You're testing my patience. But very well. Counsel, you may accompany your client. Court is in brief recess. With an impatient flick of his hand, he signaled the bailiff to escort them into his chambers. Esther could feel the eyes of everyone in the gallery following her. This was unorthodox, and it was exactly what she needed. The next word she uttered could either save her case or spark a far larger firestorm than she'd ever imagined. Judge Wilkins' chambers were surprisingly modest, a large wooden desk, 2 sets of bookshelves laden with legal tomes, and an impressive window overlooking the hustle of downtown D.C. The faint hum of traffic seeped through the glass. A framed diploma from Harvard Law hung on one wall, and on another, photographs of Wilkins shaking hands with political figures hinted at his once prominent connections. Esther, Marcus, and the judge assembled in a tense semicircle. Wilkins perched behind his desk, arms folded across his chest, visibly irritated by the interruption. The bailiff stood near the door, rigid as a statue. Make this quick, Wilkins snapped, tapping his fingers on the polished surface. I can't imagine what far-fetched story you have to tell me. Esther exchanged a brief glance with Marcus, who nodded, signaling his support. Then, taking a small breath, she began. Your Honor, I haven't been entirely transparent about who I am. My name is Esther Howard, yes, but I am also an operative and intelligence officer employed by the Central Intelligence Agency. For a moment, Wilkins simply stared, his eyes flicking with surprise. Then he let out a dismissive laugh. Is this some sort of ploy? Faking a CIA background to garner sympathy? Esther pulled a small identification badge from the inner pocket of her blazer, a discreet, official CIA-1. She laid it on the judge's desk. It bore a scannable code, her photo, and the agency's crest. The bailiff stepped forward instinctively, as though uncertain whether to confiscate it or verify it. Wilkins' expression shifted from skepticism to dawning concern. He leaned forward to inspect the credential. This could be counterfeit, he said. though his voice wavered. Marcus spoke up, his tone respectful but firm. "Your Honor, if you contact CIA headquarters and request verification, you'll see that Miss Howard is indeed who she claims to be. We ask that you do so discreetly." Wilkins' eyes narrowed. He picked up the phone on his desk, hesitated, then placed it back down. He knew that making such a call would open a Pandora's box of formalities. If it was true, he'd have to treat Esther with a measure of caution. The CIA was not an organization to be trifled with. "Why didn't you disclose this earlier?" Wilkins demanded. Esther placed her hands behind her back, standing in the posture she had learned in countless government briefings. "Because I wasn't at liberty to. The agency's involvement in property acquisitions is typically classified. I had hoped this case could be resolved without exposing my role." The judge's mind whirred. He glanced at the bailiff, then back at Esther. "And why would the CIA want real estate in D.C.? Under your name, that information is compartmentalized, Your Honor," Esther replied. "But suffice it to say, the property in question is part of a strategy for safe houses and operational resources. Officially, I hold the deed. Unofficially, it remains an asset for the agency." Wilkins let out a slow, shaky breath. The arrogance that had dominated his demeanor in the courtroom seemed to falter, replaced by a swirl of calculations. If he defied the CIA's interest, he could find himself in hot water, both politically and personally. Yet his pride bristled. He hated being outmaneuvered. He cleared his throat. "Why mention this now? Because you were moments away from ruling against me without reviewing the complete evidence," Esther said quietly. "I have the documents to prove my ownership. This property matters to national security, and I'm prepared to involve senior agency officials if necessary. But I prefer we handle it discreetly, here and now." Wilkins drummed his fingers on the desk. He didn't doubt the possibility that a high-level phone call could land him in a storm of scrutiny. CIA meddling in local court cases was no trivial matter. He could find himself subject to an internal investigation or even censure. If it was discovered he'd knowingly ruled against CIA interests without due cause. A thick silence hung in the air. Eventually, the judge shifted his gaze to the bailiff. "That'll be all. Wait outside." The bailiff opened his mouth to protest, but Wilkins snapped. "I said, wait outside." With a polite nod to Esther and Marcus, the bailiff stepped out, closing the door behind him. Now it was just the three of them. Wilkins pinned Esther with a look. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to follow the law," she replied, her voice unwavering. "Review the evidence fairly. If you do, you'll see that the deed is valid. I'm no threat to you, Your Honor. I'm simply a government employee who needs a fair hearing." The judge swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. For the first time, the power dynamic had shifted against him. He realized that the tough persona he displayed on the bench might not suffice against someone with the backing of the CIA. He slid Esther's ID back to her, almost as if it burned his fingers. "Fine," he muttered, "but let me be clear, I won't be bullied in my own courtroom. I expect full cooperation." Esther accepted the badge and slid it into her blazer. "Understood." For a moment, Wilkins just sat there, grappling with the implications. Finally, he waved a hand. "Let's return to the courtroom. I'll allow more time for your evidence. But make no mistake, Miss Howard, I will not permit you to turn my court into a circus." Esther nodded, her lips set in a thin line. "Thank you, Your Honor." As they stepped out of Wilkins' chambers, she could practically sense the reporter's gaze intensify. Something had changed. Wilkins walked with less swagger, more caution in his stride. The stage was set for a revealing showdown, one in which the judge had learned a sliver of truth if he tried to silence her. Now, He would be crossing not just a litigant, but an agency with the power to break down doors he never even knew existed. When they re-entered the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Judge Wilkins took his seat, face visibly taut. He banged the gavel with more force than necessary to restore order. The hushed crowd waited, leaning forward, hungry for any hint of what had just transpired behind closed doors. "Counsel for the defense," Wilkins said, a certain tightness edging his voice. "You may present your evidence briefly, and I do mean briefly." "The court will allow this so long as it remains relevant to the issue at hand." Marcus nodded respectfully and began summarizing the key points from the property records. He directed the court's attention to specific pages that unequivocally established Esther's legal purchase. Wilkins listened, his expression rigid, but he no longer interrupted at every breath. Then it was Esther's turn to speak. She stood, documents in hand, methodically walking through the paper trail. This time, the judge did not raise his voice or slam his gavel to silence her. He sat there, arms folded, occasionally rubbing a hand across his mouth in frustration. She could almost feel his anger simmering beneath the surface, directed not just at her, but at the circumstances that forced him to accept her testimony. On the plaintiff's side, Mr. Rourke fidgeted, clearly sensing the sudden change in the court's atmosphere. He tried to object, but Wilkins shot him down for being repetitive. Spectators exchanged knowing looks. Something significant had shifted, although they couldn't quite place their finger on the cause. Finally, Marcus rested his case, and Esther took her seat. Wilkins removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose as though fighting a headache. "I've heard enough," he announced, his voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "This matter requires due deliberation. I'll issue a ruling by the end of the week. Until then, Miss Howard's claim to the property remains intact, and Mr. Rourke is barred from further action that would infringe on her use of it." An audible gasp rippled through the gallery. It was a dramatic reversal from the judge's earlier dismissive stance. The bailiff then declared the hearing adjourned. Marcus breathed a sigh of relief, turning to Esther with a smile. "We did it," he said, though his eyes betrayed curiosity about the off-record conversation. Esther gave a curt nod, packing her files. She'd succeeded in staving off an unjust ruling, but in doing so, she'd placed a target on her back. There was no telling how Wilkins would respond to being cornered. As the spectators trickled out, Judge Wilkins disappeared into his chambers without a word to anyone. The door slammed behind him. Moments later, the muffled sound of objects crashing, perhaps a pen holder, a stack of files, or the judge's gavel, startled the bailiff standing guard. Wilkins was furious. He had been forced to bend, to listen, to let the outsider speak. Reports of the meltdown filtered through the courthouse grapevine at lightning speed. Some said the judge's shouting could be heard even in the corridor, that he cursed the day he was dumped into this ridiculous docket. Others whispered he was threatening to investigate government interference in his court. He felt cornered, humiliated emotions he'd rarely experienced in his well-tailored legal career. But in those simmering moments, as Wilkins let his anger boil over, a faint voice in the back of his mind warned him there would be consequences if he kept pushing. The CIA was not a faceless organization you could bully, and yet the judge's pride, like a wounded animal, urged him to lash out. The seeds of deeper conflict had been planted. The question now was just how far Wilkins would go to regain his sense of control. Word traveled quickly in Washington's legal circles. Within hours of the hearing, the courthouse buzzed with rumors. Some staffers whispered that they had seen Esther's CIA badge, describing the judge's face when he realized who he was dealing with. Others speculated that Wilkins might retaliate, perhaps by filing a complaint against Esther for misleading the court about her identity. That afternoon, while sitting in a small cafe near the courthouse, Esther sipped a chai latte and reflected on the day's events. The air outside was brisk, and she could feel the adrenaline that had carried her through the hearing begin to ebb away, leaving a mixture of relief and guarded apprehension. She was no stranger to stepping into high-pressure situations, but exposing her CIA affiliation in a public courtroom was a rare one she'd taken only to preserve the mission-critical property. Now, the dominoes were in motion, and she could only hope that the agency and the judge would avoid any catastrophic collision. Marcus joined her at the cafe table, coffee in hand. He leaned forward, speaking in hushed tones. "I don't mean to pry," he began, "but I have to ask what happens if the judge tries to push back. File an inquiry or, I don't know, cause trouble." Esther offered a wry smile. "We have protocols, Marcus. The agency doesn't like to draw attention to itself, especially not in civil court. It'll try to handle this quietly. Of course, if the judge wants a battle, he'll find himself facing some formidable adversaries." Marcus exhaled, shaking his head. "This is bigger than any pro bono case I've ever taken on. I'm just glad I'm on your side." The young attorney's words underscored the precarious situation. Esther was part of a powerful apparatus, but she knew the CIA's influence often operated behind the scenes. A direct standoff in the public eye could escalate quickly, damaging reputations on both sides. She expected the agency's legal department might soon intervene, sending quiet feelers to ensure Wilkins didn't cross certain lines. Meanwhile, behind the closed doors of Washington's other courtrooms and law firms, the tale of Judge Wilkins' meltdown and the mysterious Miss Howard took on a life of its own. Some attorneys laughed, saying the judge had finally met someone he couldn't bulldoze. Others, more aligned with Wilkins, murmured that she had manipulated him. They claimed she used her CIA status to intimidate the judicial system, though the truth was far more nuanced. As the stories circulated, the question on everyone's lips was what Wilkins would do next. He was notorious for his vindictive streak. If he felt cornered, he might push boundaries he'd never crossed before. Esther couldn't afford to underestimate him. She'd learned that even seemingly small opponents could become dangerous if they felt their power slip away. 3 days after the tumultuous hearing, Esther sat in a nondescript office building in downtown D.C. The exterior bore a simple plaque identifying it as a consulting firm, but inside, it housed an entire wing devoted to clandestine operations. This was one of the CIA's lesser-known satellite offices, a place where day-to-day tasks like legal documentation, strategic briefings, and operational planning were quietly orchestrated. She had been summoned by Director Edward Ross, the agency's deputy legal counsel, a wiry man in his 50s with a receding hairline and hawk-like eyes that missed nothing. Esther waited in a small conference room furnished with basic chairs and a rectangular table. A sense of déjà vu washed over her. She'd participated in countless briefings in rooms just like this all around the globe. Ross entered, flanked by 2 other individuals. Caroline Lee, a senior CIA attorney known for her tenacity, and Daniel Mercer, a high-ranking field operative who often coordinated sensitive domestic operations. All 3 wore expressions of measured concern. "Esther," Ross began, taking a seat across from her, "I'd say it's good to see you, but I wish the circumstances were different." She managed a small smile. "I didn't intend to drag the agency into this, but Judge Wilkins was about to rule against me, and the evidence was being ignored." Caroline Lee spoke up next. "We've reviewed the transcripts of the hearing, and it seems Wilkins was indeed heading toward a one-sided conclusion." She adjusted her glasses, scanning a folder packed with documents. We appreciate your discretion, but once your affiliation was out, it was out. This can't be undone. Esther nodded, feeling a pang of unease. I only revealed my status because I thought it was the best way to protect the agency's asset. Daniel Mercer, who had short-cropped hair and a military bearing, chimed in. You made the right call under the circumstances, but now we need to ensure Wilkins doesn't escalate this into a public standoff. He's known for his hot temper. Ross spread his hands on the table, his eyes fixed on Esther. We're here to discuss how to manage this. The director, and by that, I mean Director William Burns, is aware of the situation. He wants to keep this low-key. If Wilkins cooperates, we'll allow the case to proceed normally, culminating in your rightful ownership of the property. If not, he left the sentence hanging. Esther had no illusions about what if not implied. The CIA had immense pull in Washington's corridors of power. They could make life very difficult for a judge who tried to use his gavel to lash out at an agency operative. I understand, she said quietly. What's my role moving forward? Caroline leaned forward, her voice soft but resolute. Stay the course. Continue with the hearing if necessary. We'll provide any classified documents if the court demands them, though we'll file under seal. And if Wilkins attempts any retaliation, we'll respond discreetly but decisively. Ross nodded. We've placed calls to certain figures who can influence the judge's career. He'll know we're watching. A flutter of relief coursed through Esther. She wasn't alone in this battle. Though the agency could be a tough organization, it did protect its own when missions or critical resources were at stake. The property in question, after all, was not just some trifling piece of land. It was part of a strategic network. Thank you, she said, the sincerity evident in her tone. I appreciate the support. Daniel offered a tight-lipped grin. We look after each other. At the same time, be vigilant. If Wilkins is cornered, he might lash out. Don't underestimate him. Their conversation continued for another hour, delving into possible scenarios, Wilkins leaking information, calling for an official inquiry, or even trying to subpoena higher CIA officials. Each scenario had a contingency plan. By the end, Esther felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just a lone operative in a local legal dispute. She was part of a carefully choreographed dance that the agency would see through to the end. Before leaving, Ross handed her a small envelope. Inside was a direct contact line to a special liaison in case she needed immediate assistance. If anything changes, call that number day or night, he instructed. Esther slipped the envelope into her briefcase, her mind racing with the memory of countless missions. This was a different battleground, a courtroom, not a war zone, and a different adversary, a judge, instead of a terrorist. Yet the stakes felt just as high, because an institutional power struggle could unravel in ways no bullet ever could. As she stepped out of the building into the crisp D.C. air, she spotted the Capitol dome in the distance. The city itself was a mosaic of power plays, politicians, lobbyists, intelligence agencies, and yes, even judges. Each played their part. Each wielded influence in ways that could shape destinies. Esther had her allies now, and she had her mission: defend the property, secure the agency's asset, and remain unbowed in the face of a judge who thought he reigned supreme within his narrow domain. A part of her almost felt sorry for Wilkins. He was about to learn a harsh lesson in realpolitik, a lesson that would prove once and for all that the CIA was not to be trifled with. 2 weeks later, the DCS Superior Court building was once again awash in reporters and curious onlookers. A rumor had spread that Judge Wilkins was being investigated for judicial misconduct. No one knew precisely which case had triggered the scrutiny, but whispers suggested it began after a complaint was lodged by an unidentified government agency. Inside his chambers, Wilkins felt the walls closing in, An independent panel had been convened to review his recent rulings, including the hearing with Esther Howard. There were allegations of bias and improper courtroom behavior. Documents had leaked. Anonymous sources claimed it was from concerned legal professionals who believed justice was being trampled under his despotic approach. Worse still, Wilkins' once friendly political allies were distancing themselves. It was as if they sensed a sinking ship. No one wanted to share the blame for his questionable conduct, particularly not with an entity like the CIA breathing down their necks. The judge spent his days poring over legal defenses, writing letters to old friends in power, begging for help. But phone calls went unanswered, emails ignored. In private, he fumed, convinced that Esther Howard and her CIA strings were behind his undoing. He railed against the deep state, claiming he was a victim of an orchestrated smear campaign. One afternoon, while locked in his office, Wilkins received a visitor, Karen Holmes, a representative from the Point D Commission on Judicial Conduct. A stern woman with sharp features and an impeccable charcoal suit, Holmes announced she was there to collect files related to his recent hearings. Specifically, she wanted transcripts of the Rourke versus Howard case. "Why?" Wilkins growled, leaning forward in his chair as though ready to pounce. Holmes remained unfazed. "Because multiple complaints have been filed accusing you of bias and unprofessional conduct. We need to see the official records to determine if there's sufficient evidence to proceed with formal charges." His face reddened, veins pulsing at his temple. "I conducted that hearing according to the law." The plaintiff had a valid genealogical claim. Holmes raised a hand, calm and resolute. "Your personal judgment is not in question here. Your behavior is." Wilkins felt his carefully constructed world teeter. He had never feared such official scrutiny, but now he faced a tribunal that could recommend sanctions, suspension, or even removal from the bench if they deemed his actions egregious enough. When Holmes left, the judge slammed the door so hard the frame rattled. He buried his face in his hands, the realization sinking in that his career, once gilded with ambition, was now precariously perched on the edge of a precipice. Over the next week, the inquiry escalated. Witnesses, including court clerks and bailiffs, were interviewed about the judge's repeated outbursts and alleged intimidation tactics. Rumors emerged of old cases where Wilkins had suppressed evidence or dismissed legitimate claims without hearing them fully. One by one, these incidents formed a damning pattern, like puzzle pieces locking together. At the same time, the local newspapers caught wind of Esther Howard's CIA background. Though details remained murky, the press latched onto the story of a black female CIA operative forced to defend her property rights in a hostile courtroom. Articles praised her courage in facing down an overreaching judge. Public sentiment swelled in her favor, adding more weight to the commission's investigation. In the midst of this turmoil, Wilkins tried to salvage his reputation. He penned letters to the editor, insisting he was a champion of law and order, that he treated all litigants equally. But the public smelled blood, and each statement he released only generated more skepticism. Finally, the Commission on Judicial Conduct set a date for a formal hearing. Wilkins would stand before a panel of peers and possibly face the end of his judicial career. "He's reaping what he sowed," one court insider remarked bluntly. For Esther, the turn of events felt surreal. She had never intended to topple a judge, only to secure her rightful property. But as she followed the news reports, it became clear that Wilkins' downfall was more than just a personal vendetta. It was karmic retribution for years of wielding his gavel as a weapon rather than a tool of justice. A few months after the Commission on Judicial Conduct began its investigation, Judge Conrad Wilkins was quietly removed from the bench. In a terse but pointed statement, the panel cited repeated instances of bias, improper demeanor, and failure to uphold the standards of judicial conduct. He would not sit in judgment again. Some speculated he might pivot to private practice or corporate consulting, but the stain on his name would be hard to erase. Meanwhile, Esther Howard stood outside the newly renovated property she had fought so hard to retain. The dispute with Mr. Rourke had been dismissed in her favor, largely due to the undeniable proof of her legitimate purchase. With the building now firmly in her possession, Esther felt a sense of closure. Though she hadn't asked for it, cosmic justice seemed to have balanced the scales, bringing down a tyrant while validating her own integrity. She glanced at the steel-reinforced door, a discreet upgrade ensuring the site would serve its function as a safe house if it ever came to that. In the basement, a specially designed room had been equipped with secure communications, courtesy of the agency. By outward appearances, it was just another modest structure on a quiet DC block. But inside, it now boasted some of the most advanced counter-surveillance features available. Esther's phone buzzed. A message from Marcus: "Congratulations on the victory. Let's celebrate soon." She smiled. She owed him a great deal. He had stood beside her, even when the judge's wrath threatened to derail everything. It occurred to her how valuable genuine allies were, not just in intelligence work, but in everyday life. That evening, Esther took a stroll by the Washington Monument, reflecting on the series of events that had led to Wilkins' undoing. She had once believed that the most perilous battleground was behind enemy lines in far-off lands. Yet this entire episode had proved that some of the fiercest fights could take place in the very institutions designed to uphold justice. Still on active status, Esther remained ready for the next mission. Life in the CIA was rarely predictable. There was always another global crisis, another clandestine operation demanding her skills. But for now, she savored the quiet triumph. This building, this city, and her place within it were secure. At last, she paused at the water's edge of the reflecting pool, gazing at the illuminated Lincoln Memorial. In the distance, the Capitol dome stood as a beacon of democracy's ideals. She felt a stirring of hope. The system might be flawed, the players imperfect, but sometimes, with perseverance and moral fortitude, truth could still prevail. A gentle breeze whispered through the night air, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings, a whisper that reassured her, no matter how daunting the struggle, justice could still find its way, even in the heart of power. Thank you for following this rollercoaster tale of courtroom drama and covert intrigue. From the charged tensions in Judge Wilkins' courtroom to the final victory that secured Esther Howard's property and her dignity, this story reminds us that power can shift when truth comes to light. We witnessed a formidable judge fall from his pedestal after trying to silence a determined black woman, only to discover she was one of the nation's top CIA officers. In the end, justice prevailed, bringing karmic reckoning to those who abused their authority. If you found yourself captivated by these twists and turns, please give this video a thumbs up, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories. Your support helps us bring more content to life. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the most unexpected battles lead to the most powerful truths.